I'm rewatching Otaku no Video right now. Third time I'm watching it. There was a scene earlier that sort of reminded me of something I was thinking about. It was a little bit earlier in the day, but more so something that's been on my mind for a long time as an otaku. And I've talked about this before, at least in passing. And today I was actually able to like sort of formulate an idea or like able to put it into words, the concept that I'm talking about. And it's like treating being an otaku almost in the same sense as like an academic might in terms of becoming well read within something. I talked about this before somewhere when I was mentioning how when I first got into anime, I refrained from breaking into conversations like on the our anime subreddit, on a 4chan's anime board, in various places. Like I didn't post on forums for a while, and what I essentially did, at least for the first year, I was getting into anime for real after learning about it and learning about different shows. I committed to the task of watching as much as I possibly could to get up to speed, so to speak. Because a lot of times there was different discussions that I thought were interesting, and the reason I found them interesting was because of how a lot of people would name drop a variety of shows, most of which I haven't heard of before, at least at the time. So I made a myanimelist.net account and started to add a lot of those shows to my plan to watch. If anyone has seen my anime list, my plan to watch is exceedingly large in terms of like the amount of shows on there. I haven't actually taken a look at it recently, but I went on a bit of an adding spur towards the beginning of when I was getting on the site, and I think at one point I had over 1,000 shows on there. Uh, but now it's of course gone down as I've watched anime more and more, and stuff has naturally gone down. I don't actually refer to that plan to watch that much anymore, but it's there just to be there, I guess. But regardless, I treated anime as this thing that I needed to get up to speed on, and I think that was actually a good thing, at least for me, in terms of how I treat hobbies, I guess. This might be just something that I do, but I feel that maybe for the more otaku types, this might be their approach when they're getting into something, which is to like try to learn everything about it. But with anime, I tried to get the basics down and to have some sort of framework for understanding everything, because anime in general is a very vast uh, medium, I guess, and there's a lot to learn about it. It's not nearly as vast as something like music, for example, which is such a an immense pool of works to pull. It's like to take media away from that. You can't really call yourself a fan of music, honestly, because there's just so much variety that you will never be able to consume everything. But with something like anime, at least being an anime in the West, where the pool of shows and manga that you can sort of like uh, interact with on a deeper level because it's translated is a little bit smaller. And back in the day, it used to be even smaller, like in the early days of being an American otaku. But I digress. The point is that I spent a lot of time watching a lot of the basics, and even to this day, I think of it as doing my otaku homework. There's a YouTube channel I've been quite fond of recently called Mercury Falcon, and it's this guy who does a lot of videos about like 70s anime, like stuff with Leiji Matsumoto, for example. Rest in peace, Matsumoto-san. But like he talks about a lot of shows that I have maybe heard of, but most of which I haven't even heard of before, let alone have a working understanding of. And it's cool to see a channel that's like so like not necessarily laser focused, but uh, developing, helping me develop my understanding of the era and making me more interested in it, uh, and whatnot. Like as most people, like I've only interfaced with the 70s because of shows like Keto Senshi Gundam 0079, stuff like that. But even then, it's tail end of the era. But regardless, I have a lot of gaps to be filled within my anime uh, uh, backlog, my anime understanding, my personal database. And even to this day, I continue to do my homework and watch shows. Uh, I have a lot of shows that I have saved still in the back of my mind that I will return to at some point or get to. Uh, for example, a show I'm saving is Yu Yu Hakusho. Probably I'm gonna save it for a milestone like my 1300th anime or something like that, 1400th, who knows. Uh, but it's a show that I have prepared and ready for me just in the waiting. But the reason why, excuse me, I mentioned like I think maybe it's just otaku thing, but approaching anime uh, is in the same way an academic might when they're approaching a new subject that they want to get familiar with, or one that they're already within and they're trying to consume as much discourse as possible within something. Is how I approach anime, and a lot of people might not find this to be necessarily enjoyable because I'm treating it almost like homework, like I said, treating it almost like a job. Some people don't like that; they just like to passively enjoy something, and to which extent I do as well. But I consume so much anime that at a certain point, like I'm not necessarily always doing work. It's that I'm just trying to watch as much as possible, and I jump around between different tasks. Like I don't just pick a single focus to work on. Like for example, I'm not gonna sit down and watch every single cute girls doing cute things anime or watching every uh like super robot show like just blast through them all. Like I switch between them and like I watch some Gundam and then I put UC Gundam off to the side. I watch a little bit of Macross. I don't like Macross. I move on to something else. So I'm like constantly trying to build my understanding of anime. And in Otaku no Video, this was referenced pretty early on when the main character he goes to the Tanaka's, or I don't think it's even his apartment, but he goes to the apartment where all the other otaku are, and that's where their circle are. Right now they're sitting, waiting for the Nazca premiere, but they were in the apartment, and one of the characters is asking them like trivia questions, like, do you know who drew the cover illustration for this sci-fi magazine? Do you know the like this character, uh, and so on and so forth. And I think that's perhaps something that's been lost within the otaku culture and like the general otaku discourse over the years. That you don't necessarily see this as much anymore. It's a lot of like shit posting, honestly. Like it's not as serious as it might have once been. Maybe it was. I mean, I wasn't back then around there. I just said words in opposite order, but like I wasn't around back then, obviously. Um, so maybe who knows? It might have been similar, but like I was looking back on old Animage or not Animage, Blu-ray player just decided to shit itself. Animerica magazines. I was flipping through a couple of those from the early '90s. Those were the United States anime magazines. Looking at different convention stuff, looking at different write-ups. One of the things that I found curious about the magazine, which is not necessarily linked to this, but it might be the only point I can bring it up, is that a lot of the magazine was focused on telling summaries and shit and reviews. So like the cover story, they'll go into exceptional detail about what's going on in like a specific show. For example, if the magazine decides to focus on, for example, Macross, or like Macross 2 was one of them that I was looking at. It would do everything. It will tell you everything about Macross, and like sometimes it will go into like a certain amount of episodes, and it will give you a synopsis of each episode. And I suppose back then it makes sense because a lot of people didn't have the means to watch everything. They didn't have all shows disposable at their fingertips, like they could go torrent or stream them. you had to actually pay like 20-30 bucks for a VHS tape with only a handful of episodes on it. And by handful, I mean I think like two or three, honestly, maybe even four. But it was a small amount. You couldn't put too much on tape, and it wasn't cheap, so people needed to know what they were watching. But the other thing that struck me as the most interesting is how like the attitude of the magazine was significantly different from anything else, at least from what I've experienced these days, and even like looking back on old forums from the 2000s, that there's a bit more of a uh, like a geek and a nerd attitude that you saw a lot. Uh, like if you look back on like nerd and geek culture from like the 90s and stuff, uh, I was really fascinated with uh, the furry fandom for a while, and there's this documentary about it, which isn't necessary. It's pretty comprehensive, but it's obviously a bit biased. But I just find it fascinating about more how hands on the fandom was, and you can kind of see that within the otaku fandom. Um, in otaku culture back then, it was a bit more hands on in terms of how they would uh, be involved with the medium a little bit more and be involved with their hobby by doing fanzines instead of making memes. I guess you could say it's an evolution of the concept, but back then it was a bit more serious, a bit more self serious, a bit more uh, business like, a bit more formal, maybe. You can see this with the way the classical otaku would speak. The reason why otaku call each other that is because otaku is a very, not a very formal, but it's a fairly formal um, way to address someone that you don't necessarily know of. So like if you see someone on the street that you're vaguely familiar with, or and you want to be polite to them, you can use otaku to refer to them, and that's how one of the characters, the one on the left most, maybe he'll be on the right when I'm talking, but he's the guy with the green scarf. He addresses the main character as otaku when they first meet in the elevator, because otaku is obviously uh, is it a pronoun or it's something, I don't know, I'm not a grammar person. Um, but yeah, the point is that there was a bit there were a bit more uh, there was a great back then. It seemed like there was a greater value placed on one's knowledge over all else. Like it was all about what you knew, what you didn't know, how obsessive you were, and how well read you were. It was like, uh, and then when they got into circles, it was like a coming to meet with other otaku, like a summit, and you're able to discuss things and uh, have actual conversations and discuss the shows, like talk about the Macross Valkyrie uh, transformations and the significance of that, like they mentioned in one of the interviews in the show, which is something I personally found sorely lacking within the modern anime landscape. Like it's hard to find actual discourse on things, or at least people wanting to take things seriously. And a lot of people tend to default to comedy and default to like typical like borrowing of other people's ideas when they're trying to discuss something. It's not necessarily that I want to be on topic, serious boy, uh, monocle and wine glass in one hand type of thing. I want to have like a time and a place for a lot of things, and part of the reason why I left our anime in the first place many years ago was that I felt like one, it was there was too much of an emphasis placed on memes, and not enough on actual discussions. And whenever there were discussions, it was people just talking past one another. Or if you had an opinion, it's not like anyone would ever have anything to say about what you're saying, which sort of pushed me to blogging. And the other thing is, this is why I was so frustrated with my university's anime club, which is something I'll probably talk about again, which I've talked about before already, which is precisely this reason. Like when I went there, I kind of wanted a Genshiken or an otaku no video type of experience where I went there and I was able to actually talk about shows I've never talked about before with other people. Like, oh, you've also seen that. Let's talk about it. Have you seen this show? Are you watching this show? Like, what's your favorite this? But it wasn't any of that. It was just a regular ass collection of people who didn't even uh, like if you wouldn't have said it was the anime club, it would have just been a regular ass group of Ryaju types in a room who just happened to dress and act a little bit differently than everybody else. There was no difference between the type of person going to anime club and the type of person who was part of the basketball club, for example. It's just the mannerisms they had were slightly more autistic, and the things they were into were slightly different. Not necessarily that they were hardcore otaku, and that was the hardest pill to swallow for me at uni. I kind of stuck with it for a while, the anime club, but at a certain point, I got fed up with it, and I'm like, you know what? Fuck this club. Fuck everybody here. Nobody wants to talk about anime here. Like the first day, I someone it was probably the only time in university where I talked with a woman. It was probably the only person who actually tried to talk about anime stuff with me, or um, and it was about Madoka Magica. Briefly talked about Madoka Magica because she said that show was one of her favorites, so we talked about that a little bit, and then we talked about what was we were watching that season, and at the time it was fall 2017. I think it was the end of the summer season. One of the shows that was finishing was Yokujitsu, the Classroom of the Elite first season, and she was mentioning that she watched that show or was watching that show, and then I remember thinking about that, and I'm like, yeah, that show's all right. It's kind of cringe or something to that effect, with obviously expanded upon, like a good opinion, not just like a little passe type of thing. Now I mentioned something about it. She seemed confused by my clearly too based take, and then I never spoke with another woman ever again. And part of that club, I think there was like one day where I actually talked with some people, but then after that, they literally never showed up again. Um, it was bad. It was terrible. People would talk over the show that was being played. None of the shows were interesting. I had literally seen every single show that they put on the agenda for the entire year. And even at the time, I had only seen like 300 shows. I had seen them all already. So I saw no incentive to continue being there, especially if there was no actual hardcore otaku like these guys right there. Uh, I also concluded that the hardcore otaku probably aren't at the anime club. They probably share the same sentiments as I do, and I would likely never meet them. So that's at the point where I promptly decided that I would. The Genshiken clearly doesn't exist. Uh, the otaku no video experience clearly doesn't exist. It's very much idealized, or at the very least, it's not possible to get that anymore. Uh, with the current attitude that anime, quote unquote, anime fans have many quotes, like five quotes around it, fans um, have, as opposed to like the traditional otaku experience, which is depicted in otaku no video. Uh, the bar for entry has dropped far too low, and I think we need to go back to gatekeeping things.